I'm Ky.Mo, and today I'll be presenting on my topic, misuse of psychological terms and the mindset of adolescents. To begin, let's start with anxiety in adolescents. As you can see, a significant proportion of adolescents experience clinical anxiety. This is anxiety defined and diagnosed by a professional in the mental health community. All adolescents face some kind of anxiety in their everyday lives. Have this to do with testing or other factors in adolescents' lives. But the nuance between this everyday anxiety and clinical anxiety that some adolescents face is important in treating their anxiety and dealing with those who suffer from anxiety, and that will be discussed further in my presentation. The next is the misuse of psychological terms. Anxiety is an example of a misuse psychological term, and that is a term that has a clinical definition in the mental health field and psychological field that is often misused in a colloquial and everyday sense in our everyday lives. My objective for my research was to better understand a potential relationship between the misuse of these terms and a negative mindset in older adolescents. The question I asked to achieve this goal was, how do the words older teens use to describe their feelings affect how they view themselves and their mindsets? And for the purposes of this research, older teen refers to those aged 15 to 18. To begin, here is my literature review. The first study I looked at was a study by Lebrecht, who looked at the power of negative words and how they affect us in our daily lives. He found that negative words are powerful and that they affect our emotions more and create a stronger reaction within ourselves than their positive counterparts, because they live longer in our memory and rouse our emotions in different ways. The next study that's important for my research is Lilienfeld's study on commonly misused words in psychology, how they're misused, and why. Many people misuse these words because they don't know their meanings or they've become vague or undefined. Lilienfeld claims that it is important to understand these words in their true sense and not use them colloquially because, one, they cause confusion within the psychological field when there's no strong definition, and secondly, and more importantly, they heighten the stigma surrounding mental illness because it changes how we think about mental illness. For my research, I conducted a survey. The survey was in two sections. The first section asked about participants' misuse of terms, how often they do so, and how often they express negative emotions. The second section asked about a specific disorder, and I used obsessive-compulsive disorder as it is a commonly misused and misattributed disorder. This is an example of a question from my first section of my survey. It asked on this scale for participants to rank how often they misuse psychological terms, coming from never to often. The same scale was used to ask them how often they experience negative emotions. The next part was my distribution. I distributed my survey to AP psychology teachers in Western Connecticut. It was important to distribute to AP psychology teachers for two reasons. One, these students have some passing experience with psychology, thus might have a better understanding of how these psychological terms work. Secondly, this is a higher level class, and these students are often within my age range, thus limiting how many participants I had to scrap from my data because they did not fall in my 15 to 18 age range. The next part of my methods was my data analysis. In the second section of my survey, students were asked to define OCD in their own words, in their own understanding. They were then compared against the American Psychological Association's definition of OCD, which defined it as a disorder characterized by obsessions and compulsions that cause anxiety. Here's an example of some of the definitions that were provided and the score they achieved. They were scored on 0 to 3 based on how well they answered it based on these criteria listed here. Next part of my data analysis was assigning a score to the misuse of psychological terms and negative emotions, and this follows the never to often scale I mentioned previously, and they were given a 1 if they never misuse terms and a 5 if they often misuse terms. And then these two data points were compared together on a scatter plot. As you can see here, And as you can tell, there's no apparent relationship between these terms. The R-squared value, or the probability that the misuse of terms caused the negative emotions they reported, was very low. It was 0.112, an extremely low value indicating that there was no correlation between these two variables. The same could be said for when I use OCD definitions, the score they got there, and the score on negative emotions. It was, again, the R-squared value was extremely low, indicating that there was no relationship between the two variables. The R-squared value for this scatter plot was 0.0007, an extremely low value. More results that I had were not a lot of the participants were wanting to label anxiety as a 5 in terms of negativity. And the participants were about split on how negative they thought OCD was as a term when asked. My original hypothesis was that an increase of misused terms would lead to an increase of reported negative emotions, and this was not the case, as you can tell by the graphs I showed. Some other findings that were important were that only 31% of individuals correctly defined OCD, and that many individuals, 28% in fact, didn't hit any aspect of the OCD definition, and many of them failed to acknowledge a psychological component to that disorder, which is interesting as that indicates that they are misusing terms. Not only are they doing that, they are also not even considering it in a psychological way. Furthermore, individuals who felt anxious and were willing to say that they have experienced symptoms of anxiety were not willing to label themselves as anxiety, which contradicts some of my points that show that students are willing to, but that they aren't willing to label themselves as having anxiety. Some of the more findings are that 44 of these participants rated anxiety relatively positively on the scale. And that, again, participants were nearly split on if OCD was negative or not. In conclusion, there is no indication that there is a relationship between the misuse of terms, of psychological terms that is, and the reported feelings of negativity. And participants appear to be split on the issue as if anxiety and OCD are negative terms or not. The limitations of my methods, being a survey, is the vague idea of what is misusing terms. Although I provided the definition here and gave examples, it could be said that it was lost in translation what exactly misuse of terms means. It's also possible that students didn't even know they misused terms because they don't know what these words mean and they have lost their clinical meaning so much. Another limitation of the survey, as an example here, is that students don't always answer accurately or in extremes. So it makes sense that students wouldn't want to answer a 5 in terms of negativity for anxiety, because humans tend away from extremes when answering survey questions. The implications and significance is that the split between not knowing if anxiety and OCD is the most important finding that I had, which was surprising. It begs the question, how are students thinking about mental illness today? And are they thinking that it is a negative thing that has a negative connotation or not? That leads me to my further research. I believe that it would be important to look more into how students are thinking about mental illness. A limitation of my research was that because it was a survey, I couldn't ask these questions such as, why do you think it's negative? Why don't you think it's negative? I think that's what research could do and further really get to the nitty-gritty of why they're thinking about mental illness in that way. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and that is all I have.
Thank you, Kylie. How does your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So my research, none of the research I did combined the idea of misused terms and negativity, the negativity of words, that is. A lot of them talked about, how negative words influence us and how, the misuse of terms is bad, but I kind of put those together, and that the understanding I'm getting from that is that it is a very open field for research and that it should be something that looks into it. And my new finding of that, we're not looking at, teens aren't looking at, these mental illnesses the same way potentially, or they're not thinking of them in the way we expect them to in terms of the psychological component of these words.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
I think I would think more about my methods. I kind of jumped onto a survey because that's what everyone in my literature review was doing, and it seemed like the most obvious answer at the time. I would have gone in and do more of a mixed method and, really been able to sit down with participants and ask them, more leading questions about such as why do you think these terms are negative or not, because that was something that I kind of found myself wanting to know as I was going through, and I had no way of achieving because I didn't expect it to happen, and then I had no opportunity to ask follow-up questions.
How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
I got a lot of results that I found personally interesting that I wanted to, look more into, but it came down to seeing what was important to supporting my claim and what was, addressing my gap in research, how teens, are reacting towards these negative words, or do they think they're negative. I really had to take a look at what was relevant to my research and answering my research question rather than what was just interesting.
Great, Haley, thank you.
Thank you.